Hello, welcome to today's Civil Dialogues, curated and moderated by Professor Amitai Etzioni. Good afternoon, my name is Renee Littleton. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing and Communications here at Arena Stage, and it is a pleasure to have you with us here today for today's Civil Dialogue, Politics in COVID-19 Age, How to Make Democracy Work. Before we begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping notes. Please keep your audio on mute. We are looking forward to a very lively discussion, but there will be plenty of time after discussion to answer any questions. So there will be a Q&A session, and at that time, if you can, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, click the raise your hand button, and we will make sure that you are recognized. Turn your audio on, turn your video on, so that we can hear your questions and continue the conversation. So of course, without further ado, I'd now like to get us into this civil dialogue, and I'd like to introduce our curator and moderator, Professor Amitai Etzioni, for which we are very grateful for this partnership. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. I very much appreciate working with Arena Stage. We've been doing this now. It's our fourth year, but only the second time on Zoom. You can see all our previous civil dialogues on YouTube, and we're also going to record this one today. I want to get out of the way as quickly as possible, but I want to say that we had 470 people from not only from all over the United States, but from other countries signing up for the session. So I think we're surely going to have an interesting discussion toward the end of this dialogue, though I'm not sure we can get everybody's question today. The way we're going to do that is I'm going to raise three questions just to get the conversation rolling. And from then on, I'll get out of the way and I'll listen to my esteemed colleagues. So the first question, I think, to get us started, is there are a lot of people who are concerned about the future of the coming election. Today, the New York Times, there's a whole page on it. Emily Bazelon had a long article about it in the New York Times Magazine. It's all over the place, which is by itself a sign of concern. And basically, the people raise concern about three different stages of the process. Some people are concerned that President Trump may move and delay the elections. This has been done in other countries, and recently all kind of primaries were rescheduled. So in a sense, there's a precedent. Of course, primaries are not federal elections. And second, people are concerned about voter suppression. And that is not only a theoretical issue, it is happening by some observers in many states. Just to give one example, in Florida, the majority of the voters granted what's called these days returning citizens. In my days, it was called ex-cons. The right to some 1.4 million people to vote, and the Republican legislator put so many requirements on implementing that right that in effect we probably reduce it maybe to 50,000. A judge today set that aside, but it's just an example of many things happening. So A, will the election take place as scheduled? How severe will voter suppression be? And three, will the president honor the result of the elections? There have been, he kept already challenging the validity of voting by mail and talks about rigging. We have to remember that even at the last election, which he won, he kept challenging the validity of the process because he was not happy with the fact that the media reported that the popular vote was higher for Hillary Clinton. So the question to you is, first of all, on these three fronts, how serious is the problem as you see it? And please tell us not only the problem, but what can be done about it. Because I keep reading people saying, well, it's in the Constitution, but the Constitution is not self-implementing. And the question is, can we rely on the court, especially this court, to keep us honest? So in the first round, we just go alphabetical order, and please introduce yourself and tell us, take it from here, Professor.
Hi, my name is Tabatha El-Haj. I'm a professor of constitutional law and with a focus on American democracy at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And my interest in the law of democracy is really about thinking about democracy as a whole and not just elections. And so I think I'm very interested in this question of faith in our democracy beyond faith in our elections. But obviously, if we don't have elections, that would be a significant step towards not having faith in democracy. I think to your question, I'm of two minds about how to answer that, because on the one hand, I think that there are more risks today than in any previous point, let's say, at least up to the Civil War, but there are significant issues. I think the election is likely to occur in a different way than in 2018 or 16. I think we probably will see more mail-in voting. But I actually think the more that I feel like we should plan for the risks, but the more that we talk about the risks, the more we may be undermining the possibility of a peaceful transition. And so I do think there's an importance in recognizing that, of course, there are some risks, but there are actually lots of limitations on the president's power to just not have elections. I think the fact that we have 50 states, and that in a lot of those instances, state elections are really about the governor's power more than the federal government's power is important, unless Congress actually acts through legislation. And I think the bigger issue is just to sort of be working as the media and as experts to remind the public that actually there is no significant problem of voter fraud, that we should be, and to remind the public about the things in democracy that are working. And one thing is that we do have a two-party system. It is definitely in the interest of the parties both to push back if there is voter suppression. We do have courts that function. We have courts that function, again, at multiple levels. So like in Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court did sort of rule that they would not enforce a norm of non-partisan gerrymandering, but the Pennsylvania Supreme Court reached different consideration, and we have had redistricting here. So I think all of the federal, all the moving parts create potential, and I think it is sort of incumbent on experts and the media to paint a picture that is not all dire. Otherwise, there will be increased rhetoric about stolen elections, which I think will make it more possible for that to occur.
Well, I guess I'm next. I'm Bill Galston. My day job, insofar as one can distinguish day from night any longer, is as a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. I'm a political scientist by trade. I've wandered in and out of 6 presidential campaigns and one presidential administration. At least as much to the point, about 20 years ago, I founded a research center, which is still in existence, to study and perhaps to do something about the political and civic engagement of young adults, one aspect of our politics that I think will be especially important in the year 2020. Like Professor El-Haj, I think I would describe myself as a concerned optimist. I think things are likely to play out reasonably well, but we should be aware of the downside risks and prepared to address them to the extent that they actually materialize. To answer Amitai Etzioni's 3 questions as crisply as I can, with regard to the timing of national elections, the Constitution of the United States could not be more unambiguous. The president does not have the power to affect the timing of national elections, period, full stop. Now, when we get to Professor Ornstein, who's worked on emergencies and what to do in the case of great discontinuities in the government, he may offer a different take on this for all I know. But the Constitution itself is unambiguous, and I can't imagine any court in the country finding otherwise. If Congress does not change the date of the election by law, and if the president does not sign that legislation, it cannot change, period, full stop. Will there be voter suppression? Well, as we all know, there's been controversy, increasing controversy on this subject in recent years, but the topic of the year is really mail-in ballots, voting by mail. Here again, I'm an optimist because nearly every state, has absentee ballot provisions, and 29 states, including all of the contested states, have in effect no excuses absentee ballots, which means you don't have to give a reason to request an absentee ballot. All you need to do is request it. And I don't anticipate any of those states between now and November changing that provision. And so there may be some debate at the margins, but I think that mail-in voting ought to proceed pretty smoothly according to existing law. With regard to the third question, will the president accept the results of the election? This is a president who does not lose easily. And even when he loses, he never concedes that he has lost. So that's a topic of, I think, legitimate worry. But I would say this: everything depends on whether the president stands alone in questioning the results of the election, or whether his political party stands behind him when he does. So I think the most crucial actors in the days and weeks after the first week of November will be Republican elected officials. If they finally draw the line and say, we cannot cross the line that the president has just crossed, I think we'll get through this okay. If it turns into a partisan battle, then all bets are off.
We lost one of our colleagues, so Norm, it's your turn.
Okay, thanks, Amitai. I'm Norm Ornstein. A few things I would mention in the introduction. I'm a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and been there for a long time. I'm also chairman of the Campaign Legal Center, which, by the way, brought the lawsuit in Florida and which gave us at least the ability for now to eliminate what was effectively a poll tax on people who had served their sentences and were given by referendum a right to vote in Florida. And we will be doing more of that. Third, Bill alluded to this a little bit. I participated in and helped create a continuity of government commission in the aftermath of 9/11, where we looked at a whole series of things that could occur that would create discontinuity, both in the ability of Congress to meet and function, presidential succession, and the Supreme Court, but also on elections. And it wasn't just the possibility of a terrorist attack, something we also have to keep in mind here, because a terrorist attack doesn't necessarily mean planes going into buildings. It can also mean interfering with voter registration numbers, an electrical grid shutdown, all kinds of things that could happen that could disrupt an election, but also natural disasters. And remember, we had an anthrax scare in the aftermath of 9/11, which raised some of the questions that are parallel now with a pandemic. And we're reconstituting this group and working on many of these areas. Let me address just a few of the things that you mentioned and respond to a couple of the comments that my colleagues made. I would say I'm a little less optimistic than both Tabatha and Bill. I'm a little more worried, and there are many fronts. First, with the voting itself, Bill is absolutely right. The president has no authority to cancel or change an election. I mentioned one other thing. I created a group, or helped create a group called Why Tuesdays some years ago, asking the question about why we vote on Tuesdays. And it's because our federal elections are governed by an 1845 law that set the election date at the first Tuesday following the first Monday in November, so that in an agrarian society, people could have time to travel to get to market day and then get back home and also have time for the Sabbath. So we vote on Tuesdays because of an agrarian society's needs that are absolutely irrelevant to today. But that's set by law. Congress could, in theory, change the law if the pandemic is much worse. But there are other things in the law and in the Constitution, dates that are firmly set: when the electors meet, when you actually certify the votes of those electors, when Congress meets to decide which slates of electors to include and certify the results of the election, and when we actually have an inauguration. And at noon on January 20th, the president, if he does not win, is no longer in office. And there may be somebody else, not necessarily set by the election, but that's a topic for another day. I'm worried on a host of fronts. Worried not just that the pandemic could disrupt election results, that many states will drag their feet when it comes to letting votes by mail go out. To skip ahead a little bit on voter suppression, we know that the California Republican Party has filed a lawsuit to try and prevent the governor there from sending out absentee ballot applications to everybody in California, and that President Trump, pretty remarkably, tweeted threats to the governors of Michigan and Nevada, first saying inaccurately that they had sent out absentee ballots when they had actually done applications, but threatening to withhold federal funds if they move forward with what he said was illegal, which is perfectly legal. We also know that our postal service is going to run out of money in 2 months unless Congress provides an ample amount to keep it going. And if the postal service is starved for funds and can't fulfill its duties, vote by mail may not work. And I'd mention one other thing that relates to the third point in some ways. Many of our states are not geared up and don't have the infrastructure to count large numbers of absentee ballots when they haven't had so many in the past. States that might have had 5 or 10% of their ballots cast by mail that may get 50, 60, or 70%. We know in California that there were a number of elections in the midterms where we did not know the results for days or even weeks after the election itself, because it takes time to count these ballots, and California is more geared up for that. And we know that the results on election eve were quite different in some congressional races from what the final results were because of the particular mix of people who voted by mail. And we know that President Trump and other Republicans challenged the legitimacy of some of those elections, saying that they were rigged because the results were different from election eve. One of the things that I'm doing with a couple of task forces and working groups on election security is trying to educate people in the media who will be doing election results on election eve, to make it clear over and over again, before and after, that the results that you see in some states may not be what we end up having, and it may take a week or 10 days or more. And we need to have federal funds and state funds provided to states to be able to handle a different way of voting than they've done it in the past. Will we see more voter suppression? I think we're going to see it on many fronts, not only with the attempts to discourage votes by mail that we've seen, very different position, by the way, than Republicans had in the past when they believed that they were the ones who were benefiting most from voting by mail. But I'm also worried a little bit that we will have some of these armed people who are now out there demonstrating at state capitals and elsewhere against the social distancing measures that we have in place, turning out and trying to discourage people from voting. there's another court case that's worth mentioning here, which is the Republican Party had been enjoined for many years from participating in some of these efforts that were designed on election day to turn people away from the polls. The court basically said that was no longer applicable. And that was, to me, very similar to when Chief Justice Roberts, when he blew up the Voting Rights Act with Shelby County, said, oh, we don't have to worry about racism anymore, and we've seen what's happened there. So there are many things, formal and informal, that could lead to attempts to suppress votes, and we need to worry about all of them, and we need to make sure that we have resources and measures in place and pre-warning for the kinds of things that could happen so that we don't get those disruptions on election day. Now, I'd mention just one last thing, which is after the election itself, there's something else that concerns me, and that is that we may see some states going against the election results and having state legislatures or governors or both saying, we don't trust these results, and we're going to send a different slate of electors to Washington to be counted. If we have many different slates of electors and contested slates of electors, it gets very complicated, but it's quite possible that we won't have a result in the end, and that we may see yet again a replay in a somewhat different fashion of what we had with Bush. Electors can be counted, and that's a nightmare that I really don't want to spend a lot of time contemplating.
Yascha.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for everybody for covering for me. I'm going to claim an honorary status as somebody with a last name of Z or Y or something behind O. My internet connection was briefly gone. I hope it's going to be more stable for the rest of our conversation. So I missed some of what my distinguished co-panelists were saying, but let me hopefully not repeat too much by focusing a little bit on the global perspective. I think we've had a wonderful introduction to the challenges of democracy here in the United States in the next months and the worries we have about the election. And I think all of those are very serious. I'm going to try and think for a moment about what this virus is going to do in the international system. That are global events, which validates or seems to validate the basic way of talking and thinking about the world that populists and particularly right-wing populists around the world have better than COVID-19. I would have struggled to do so. I think for many people, it will now seem much more plausible than it did 3 or 4 months ago, that the world is a very dangerous place, that there's a lot of point in closing down borders, that immigrants and outsiders can bring in disease, that there are big downsides to globalization, that we have allowed too much of our production to go abroad in a way that makes us helpless when there's an actual challenge in the world. I don't think all of those talking points are approximately true. I think it's much more complicated than that in each of those cases, and some of those talking points are outrightly false. But they seem more plausible than would have done 4 or 5 months ago to a lot of people because of COVID-19. And that should give a big boost to right-wing populists. And in some countries where they have been relatively competent and where they have seized on the ability to essentially rule the political system with an iron fist already, it has in fact allowed them to quash democracy altogether. So when you look at countries like Hungary, which were rapidly veering away from democracy even before COVID-19 hit, people like Viktor Orban have used this moment in order to suspend parliament for an indefinite period of time, abrogate to themselves the power to rule by decree, criminalize the spreading of quote-unquote false rumors in social media, which in one case included a gentleman who criticized Viktor Orban as a dictator. And lo and behold, 2 weeks later, the police turned up on his doorstep and arrested him for having called Viktor Orban a dictator. QED. So I think that there is a risk of this happening in many places, and certainly in some countries, it will allow these right-wing populists to just get rid of the last vestiges of democracy. Now, I also think that there's a more optimistic story to be told, which is that Populists for a long time have said that we shouldn't trust experts, that there's no need for independent institutions, that government is only ever the problem and never the solution, and that they alone can protect us, that they will actually stand up for us and make sure that we're safe in a way that, you know, ordinary good old-fashioned, more moderate, more technocratic, less populist, it's become very clear that actually the populists are failing at that fundamental promise that they have made. And one thing that makes me perhaps a little bit more optimistic than my fellow panelists is that I fear for the integrity of elections in the fall. I fear for the mudslinging we're going to see for the next 6 months from the White House, which is going to be even worse. It's hard to imagine than what we've experienced over the last 3.5 years. I think there's a good chance that a good number of Americans are looking at the criminal inaction from the White House, at the fact that we don't have any coherent federal response to this immense challenge that has at this point killed over 100,000 Americans, and get very, very angry. And the question we tend to ask about that is wrong. The question we tend to ask is, what will it take for Donald Trump's most committed base, for his super fans, to change their mind?
Okay.
Americans who voted for him in 2016 who were not part of that base, who were not part of a super rejuvenate some of these democratic rules and norms when I've been at pretty much any point in the last 3.5 years.
We seem to have some technical difficulty in getting Professor Mounk, so maybe I will do the next round. Those of you behind the scene who work on the technicalities can help see if we can get a clearer line. So before we move on to the next question, I want to ask you, I'm not going to try to summarize all the wonderful things you heard, but maybe you could just each give us a very brief answer to because I want to get clarity on one point. If the result of the election are challenged, and if the matter goes to the Supreme Court, what kind of resolution do you expect from the Supreme Court? Just a very short, brief answer, please.
Well, it's hard to answer that question in the abstract, Amitai, because it depends on the substance of the challenge. And you know, we have the answer to one very specific kind of challenge in Bush v. Gore, mm-hmm. of blessed memory. Different kinds of challenges raise fundamentally different legal issues. Mm-hmm. And so I find it very, very hard to respond to the question as posed.
So implicitly you trust the court to judge it on the merits of the presentations.
So I jump in. I want to say I think we have seen the courts do better than one might expect if you only see them as partisan institutions through the Trump administration, where the issues have been clearly about the rule of law. And by that I mean, I think when the first round of executive orders came around immigration, both Republican and Democratic judges stood against the executive order. Now, some of you will say, well, in the end, the Supreme Court upheld the third iteration of the executive order. But by the time the third iteration had come up, it had been scaled back in important ways, and it had been more sort of just gone through rule of law kinds of processes. The liberals on the court thought that they were post hoc justifications. They were probably right about that. But Chief Justice Roberts, to his credit, I think, in a way that is very different than what he was like in Shelby County, I think Chief Justice Roberts made clear that Korematsu and explicit racism was unconstitutional, reaffirmed that. And he took this very like, well, we're gonna not second guess that there's this presumption of regularity in the executive branch, which is longstanding as a rule of law principle that the courts don't second guess what the executive branch does and assume nefarious purposes. Then a year later in the census case, right, when the administration tried to put forth these same sort of, well, we can add in the census question because it's been in the census before and so on, when the actual motivations were unmasked, the Chief Justice switched. So I think I agree with Bill. You can't say what the question is in the abstract. There are certainly there are ways that the issue could end up before the court where the court will think that there is a genuine issue of fairness or a genuine concern about an interest in keeping the Republicans in power, whatever. But I think that if it seems like there's a fundamental rule of law issue, I think that Chief Justice Roberts is much more worried about the court as an institution than he was 10 years ago, really 10 years ago when he decided Shelby County. And I think I agree with Bill again. I think what the Republican Party does if the president questions the election is essential, but I am much more worried that elected members of the Republican Party are unlikely to distance themselves from the president. Maybe if he really loses, and they lose a lot in the Senate, they will finally do so. But I think what we have seen is Republicans who are not in office are willing to stand up for the rule of law. And so the courts have somewhat done that, even if they're Republican judges. And so I would say I am cautiously optimistic, and I really hope that we don't get there, because I think for the long-term health of the court, it will be a disaster if the court has to decide the election.
Thank
So
you.
that's why I would say we should plan
No,
outcome.
So I'm optimistic.
Noam, you want to join us before?
Yeah, I wish I could be optimistic.
What's the next question?
Yeah, wait, before we do, Amitai, let me hope, I'm not so optimistic. First, on every issue of campaign finance, voting rights, redistricting, anything involving the electoral process, the court has gone 5-4 in a partisan way, and Roberts has written many of those decisions, including instances where it should have been pretty clear. We know that there was an easy standard, for example, on partisan gerrymandering. And Roberts basically made a bunch of stuff up about how this was gobbledygook. I don't see a single case involving voting rights or elections where we have any reason to be optimistic. Now, it may be just clear cut. It may be that it's a naked power grab and it's obvious in most places. I think Roberts wouldn't go along with that. But what we have to keep in mind is there are ambiguities in the Constitution when it comes to deciding disputed elections. And we know we've had these before, and we know that they have ended often, or they did in the 19th century and in 2000 with very squishy and questionable results. Who decides which slate of electors? If we have disputes and the House and Senate can't agree, the Constitution says it's the slate that has the governor's signature. But what becomes the numerator? What becomes the denominator? All of these decisions that are not absolutely clear cut, I really worry that there's a thumb on the scales and a 5-4 vote.
I'd like you to lead on the next question. And that is, we hear a lot about how obstinate the Trump supporters are, how they, despite all the news, they don't budge and they stick loyally to him. But some people are also concerned about people on the left. And so, for instance, according to some recent report, only 2 to 3% of the Sanders supporters are now contributing to the Biden campaign. Of course, there are other, this is not a conclusive indicator, but it's just one indicator. And recently, 21 progressive members of Congress put forward a call on cutting the military budget, which is not going to, very unlikely to pass, but again sends a signal. So some people argue that in the current situation, what you need is people put everything aside to ensure that Trump doesn't get reelected. On the other hand, that people feel very strongly that we need not just to get Trump out of the office, but we need major structural reforms in justice and social discrimination are rampant. It's not enough to have an election only on the question of who's going to be the head of state, but also on what kind of policies, and therefore they're pushing Biden to the left. So we used a lot of time on the first question. So if you could have more succinct answers on the second one. Mounk, why don't we start with you? Yascha?
Oh yeah. Look, so it really depends how you're thinking about this. There's a lot of arguments being made that Biden really needs to consolidate the party in order to win the election, and it's absolutely clear that Democrats need to be able to mobilize the base. They need to be able to rally their troops. But a lot of the discussions that you see among the kinds of people who join a seminar on Memorial Day in order to talk about politics are way off from where most voters are. If you look at the second most preferred candidate of Joe Biden voters, it was Bernie Sanders. And if you look at the second most preferred candidate of Bernie Sanders voters, it was actually Joe Biden. There was a poll recently in which about 3% of people say that they would vote for independent rather than either Trump or Biden. And Biden was ahead by about, Trump was ahead by about 2 points in that poll. And so a lot of people, which by the way was an outlier because Biden is ahead in virtually every poll that's been taken in the last months. And so a lot of people on Twitter were saying, you see, we got to move left in order to capture these 3% of people, and that's what's going to put Biden across the top. Well, actually, that same poll also asked people who they would pick if they had to choose just between Biden and Trump, and on that metric, Trump actually was 3 points ahead in that poll. So in other words, the independent voters in that poll were not people on the far left who were not willing to turn out for Biden. There were people who were conservatives who didn't like Trump, or there were moderates and so on and so forth. So yes, Democrats need to rally their base. Yes, there are some very good ideas that come from the left of the party that are more structural reform. There's many things in America that require structural reform. When we look at the huge failure of state capacity of US government in response to COVID-19, I think that's obvious. There's a lot of popular ideas there that Biden should take on. He should try to rally the troops and unify the party. But the idea that after having won the primary resoundingly by being in the center left, Biden should now win the general by running to the far left, I think is just not backed up by the facts.
Yeah. Bill, would you take it from here?
Oh, I'm sorry, Amitai. I'm basically where Yascha is. I think in the end, the significance, just to start with 1 point, of that 3% figure for third-party and independent candidates is that it's only half of the 6% that we saw in 2016. And this is an election, I think, in which, to a much greater extent than was true in 2016, people will be choosing sides, and they know what the stakes are on both sides. I'd add also that the Biden campaign is doing what it can to cement party unity while not moving too far off the position that enabled that enabled Biden to win the Democratic primaries resoundingly. Some compromises will be made, and the situation in the country has changed so significantly at this point, compromises should be made. The argument that the COVID-19 pandemic has unmasked a number of structural flaws in current arrangements is, I think, a pretty potent one. And you don't have to be a democratic socialist, for example, to believe that our system of unemployment insurance, which we basically inherited from the 1930s, is in tatters and needs to be replaced with something much more effective, much more national, a truth so palpable that a number of conservative Republicans are now jumping on the structural reform of unemployment insurance bandwagon. So I'm an optimist that party unity can be secured without making disastrous compromises that would fundamentally weaken the posture of the ticket going into the fall. But note that this is a fundamentally different question from the first question that we dealt with, because it deals with the consequences of politics as traditionally and legitimately played. It has nothing whatsoever to do with breaches of rules or with fundamental challenges to the legitimacy of the political order.
No?
So a couple of things. First, I am more optimistic. Bernie Sanders came around much more quickly and much less reluctantly to supporting Biden than he did when it came to Hillary Clinton in 2016. Most of Bernie's top people, with a few notable exceptions, have done the same thing. And as Bill said, Biden has reached out. He's brought in many very progressive people into task forces on the policy front, which is more symbolic, but that's important as well. I would just raise a caveat, which is we know that the Republican Party, Trump, and outside groups are going to spend a fortune to define Joe Biden as the worst possible character that the country could imagine. And some of that will be aimed at alienating the left, trying to turn this into a choice rather than a referendum, given where we are in terms of a referendum, and make it a lesser of two evils thing again, get people to decide not to vote, or almost certainly there will be a candidate on the left for the Green Party who may drain away some votes. And we know the Russians are likely to be involved in doing the same thing, trying to alienate some of the elements of the base of the Democratic Party. I'm just much less concerned that that will be effective this time, especially if we continue down the path that we're on, where we will have both an economic and a health disaster that will get worse before it gets better by the time we get closer to the election. And mostly what we've known in the past is that voters make up their mind on economic conditions by about the third quarter or even before. And at this point, that's really bad news for Trump. And we have to hope that it's not close in the end, in any event.
Professor Boyd, last word?
I guess what I really want to say is what I'm most concerned about is how the Democratic Party in particular is going to get out voters, and not that I'm worried they're not going to get out the 3% of Sanders voters, but that this election turns on turnout. And turnout, as we were talking about earlier, is very much about mobilization, face-to-face politics, interpersonal politics. We've had all these organizations that were set up to do that kind of mobilization, and now we have this period of shelter in place where they're not doing that. And I think that because it's not about turning out just the 3% Sanders voters, it's about turning out the person who just lost their job, who may be worried about their kids. You know, it's the intermittent voters and the hope that we would get new young voters into the electorate. And that is going to be much harder. And that is going to be harder at a mobilization level, but it's also going to be harder at a law level. Registering to vote is very time intensive. It usually happens in person. It requires a lot of documents. And that is a whole order before we get to, you know, will the votes be counted on time? Will people get their mail-in votes on time? What will be the you know, like there are a million election minutia that can go wrong, but if you can't get people to register who are intermittent voters or new voters, and if you can't get them interested because they're so preoccupied with their personal life, health, economic situation, that I think should be our primary focus.
Wow, that is excellent discussion already. So we have about 15 minutes before we invite everybody else to join us with their question. For the last question I like to raise, and that is a more, not tied immediately to the current election, but a more a general question, and not also certainly not limited to the United States. And that is the founding fathers were very worried about the mob. And the whole idea of representative democracy was to avoid the notion that people will react on their impulse and vote. And the idea was there's going to be a deliberative process where people are going to meet in the legislature, discuss things in public, engage the public in discussion, and after months of deliberation, a new shared understanding will arise. The question is, to what degree the social media now, by making it so easy for a demagogue to reach directly to people and skip the deliberative process, to what degree it makes democracy ever more difficult. It's not only a question of deliberating in Washington. So here, you guys had earlier, young lady, you had a chance to introduce yourself earlier, and I just add one thing about myself. I spent 20 years at Columbia University working with Professor Lazarsfeld, who was considered one of the great students of public opinion. And he came out with this insight, what he called the two-step process. And he collected data, I wrote a whole book about that, to suggest that the media was really in those days, in the olden days, not connecting directly to the people, but mainly connecting to opinion leaders, to the clergy in an African-American church, to a labor leader, and people were interacting in their communities, processing the information, paying mind to their fellow community members and to the local leaders before they're making up their mind. And the question is now again, if the social media does not short circuit all that and prevents the deliberative processes, both on the local and on the national level, if it's a problem, what is there any correction? So if you could make that relatively quickly, then we'll have a time for all these people who are dying to ask you all kind of questions. So who wants to take the lead here?
I'll start in that case. I'm worried on a couple of fronts. We've lost a lot of what we would hope to see in a deliberative process in our national institutions for some time. Tom Mann and I did a book back in 2006 called The Broken Branch, really lamenting the loss of the regular order and any great sense of the deliberative process. Social media has accentuated that, and it's created the kinds of divisions that you've talked about, and it's accentuated the tribalism that we have. And one of the things that we see now is that gatekeepers and opinion leaders have divided and don't work in quite the same way. If you think about who could transcend the differences that we have now, who could be a leader, for example, if we really did set up something to get ourselves through the pandemic. The one person who would come immediately to mind to me would be Bill Gates, who has now spent a good share of his considerable fortune with his wife and his foundation and trying to bring about health outcomes all around the world, who has done a lot on the pandemic already, and who now is, we see that 40% of those who watch Fox and get information from talk radio believe that he's doing this so that he can get chips inside of us to follow us around. We're in a world where conspiracy theories and wild claims and QAnon and things like that can take people off in a very bad direction, and where you can get information that is not factual and yet believe it, and where it can drive out any sense that experts or facts matter anymore. And just one last point, Twitter as social media are trying to figure out how to deal with the outside influence of pernicious groups like the Russians or the Chinese, as well as what's happened inside. And a little while ago, they issued a directive that they weren't going to take world leaders off their medium, but when they did things that would otherwise violate and get people banned, they would note it. Well, for the last week or 10 days, Donald Trump has repeatedly and outrageously accused one of our major media figures, Joe Scarborough, of participating in a murder, which is outlandish, false, defamatory, despicable, and there has not been anything from Twitter that says, hold on here, this is violating our standards. So our social media themselves, in terms of policing the process, have fallen woefully short and don't seem to be doing much about it.
I'm going to be the optimist again. I'm actually not an optimist. I think we'd all be better off if we got off of social media, but I actually think there's some reason to think people are. I'm sure that some of you have seen this news report, but apparently David Muir's ABC News program has had its ratings like rocket high. It's like, I assume, the equivalent of like Peter Jennings in the 1980s when I was growing up, and he's got more than 12 million viewers, and the next two competitors are the other nightly news. And it's not just people over 65. He's got a new influx of 25 to 54-year-olds who are going back to watching the nightly news. And I think there's been evidence of sort of increased faith in the experts, Fauci and the governors who have gotten a lot of media, people watching them, and the health commissioner, I think it's the health commissioner in Michigan, who's extremely well liked, or maybe it's Ohio. So I think, again, one problem with social media, again, I don't want to deny that there are huge problems with social media, as we saw in 2016, but I also think that there is perhaps this crisis has brought some shift among not either the far left or the far right, but the middle, of sort of wanting a different kind of news, looking to a different place. And I also just want to say, American democracy has been lousy for a long time. I really recommend to everybody Rick Hassen's book, Election Meltdown, which I think is a great book. But there's also a great review of it on Balkanization by Franita Tolson, who pointed out that, it's not like there hasn't been equivalent levels of voter suppression, or even worse. And much of American democracy was non-deliberative, and certainly excluded people between African Americans in the South for a long period of time. So it is also, I think, we still have a long history of working with a system that's deeply problematic. That's my take.
Let me jump in, because I think that my opinion may be somewhere in the middle of those two. So I agree with Norm that the way to think about social media is as a structural shift. So, even 25 or 30 years ago, we really lived in a world of one-to-many communication. So if you wanted to reach a lot of people, you had to have access to the columns of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or you had to be featured on one of the broadcast networks. And so there was a kind of vetting process. Now that also excluded a lot of important voices, a lot of interesting voices, but it did make sure that people who, frivolously accused major figures of American life of murder without any kind of evidence just would not have had the voices heard in those kinds of networks. Well, now we live in a world of many-to-many communication. Despite my repeated internet troubles today, it's possible for us to sit in 5 different locations and reach a considerable audience just from the devices we use every day. In any case, it's an incredible transformation. But in that world of many-to-many communication, it obviously becomes much easier for people to incite hatred and to lie and to form new political movements. So the distance between the gatekeepers in society, the elites in society, and everybody else has shrunk considerably. Now, I think what's optimistic is that there shouldn't be a reason why that systematically helps populists. I think it helps political outsiders. I think it brings more political instability with it, and those are all potentially worrying things. But it should be possible for defenders of decent values to have big reach in social media as well. It should be possible for more mainstream political parties to up the social media game. I think slowly, we are starting to do that. I think some of the novelty of the outrageous claims is wearing off. I think, if Joe Biden wins the election in the fall, it's in large part because a lot of people think, I just want to be able to go back to, watching football on a Monday night and talking about that with my friends in the bar rather than having to talk about politics all of the damn time. So I don't think that shift is unidirectional. It can be exploited by different political forces. And if the people who are standing up for our constitutional system and for decent values have a culture of their convictions and actually use those platforms for their own purposes, I think we can beat back those populists who certainly profited from social media. Wouldn't have been possible in this form without social media, but who aren't the only people with a Twitter account.
I promise to answer your question briefly, Amitai, so we can get on to questions from the hundreds of people around the country and the world. Point number one, and for the record, I think that the legal architecture designed a quarter of a century ago that has allowed damaging anarchy in the field of social media needs to be rethought from the ground up. There's no time to discuss that now, but we do not need to have the kind of situation that we're contending with right now. That's point one. Point two, with regard to the effect of social media in the 2020 campaign, I'm an optimist for a reason that hasn't been stated yet. I think this is going to be a serious election about issues that voters can judge for themselves based on direct experience without resort to the media. Two in particular. Number one, how is the economy doing and are they satisfied with the president's stewardship of it? And number two, how is the pandemic going? And same question, are they satisfied with the president's stewardship of that? Those are going to be the two pivotal questions. And I don't think that people are going to be taking their cues principally from social media in responding to those questions and voting based on their responses.
Well, not only was it an excellent discussion on all the three issues I raised, but we're very much within the time frame called for. So thank you all for that. And so now the people whose faces you don't see, my technical partners behind the scene, going to introduce various questions. I asked those of you ask questions or make comments. Be brief to give other people a chance. So let's make it happen.
Hi, our first question comes from one of the attendees in the audience. His name is Kenneth. Kenneth, I am going to turn on your microphone now to let you ask the question.
Okay, hi Norm, and hi Bill, and hi other panelists. This is Kenneth Shepsley from Harvard University.
Hey, Ken.
Hi. The question, I guess, mainly to Norm and Bill, but the other panelists are welcome to chime in, is nobody has mentioned the role that potentially could be played by Mitch McConnell in terms of the legitimacy of the election result. Now, Mitch McConnell can either win or lose his own Senate seat, and his party can lose or retain the Senate. So we have political science's famous 2x2 table. I don't expect you to interpret all four cells, but I'd be curious to know what your views are of the role potentially to be played by the Senate Majority Leader. Thank you.
Go on, Norm.
It's more complicated, of course, Ken, than a 2x2 table, as you know. McConnell is going to do whatever he can to retain the Senate control for the Republican Party, obviously to keep his own seat. But, and one of the things that's an interesting twist here, of course, is that the actual count of the electoral votes takes place on January 6th, while the new Congress and the new Senate convenes on January 3rd. So if we end up with a 50-50 Senate, which is a real possibility, one of the more interesting questions is not just the role that Mitch McConnell would play, but the role that the vice president would play as presiding over the Senate. And it's not clear from the Constitution if he would have the ability to cast a tie-breaking vote, for example, if there's a question about either a slate of electors or actually who becomes the vice president. But beyond that, McConnell, I think, from the day of the election forward, probably from the day before the election and the weeks before the election, is going to use whatever power he has to make sure that he retains his seat, they retain their majority, and that Trump can get elected. What role he can play with that, you could think of it along a number of lines, but one of them, of course, is whether there's another vacancy on the Supreme Court. And one of the things that McConnell has made clear is if there's a vacancy on January 19th, and he's still in the majority, he'll jam through a confirmation of a new a new Supreme Court justice, even if there's going to be a new president taking over the next day. So if I were a Democrat in an elective office or just simply a voter, I look at Mitch McConnell with a very jaundiced eye looking ahead to what role he might play.
Let's take the next question, please.
Sorry, I'm just going to just jump in for 5 seconds. I just want to say one very simple thing about this, which is this is one more reason why it's really important that Joe Biden doesn't just play for victory, but for a big victory. One reason is just all of these questions about how exactly the election is going to be ratified and what kind of dirty tricks Trump and his allies might get up to. And the other reason that I want to briefly mention is that it's very, very important that we eventually have two functional political parties in the United States again that are both committed to the basic values of our constitutional system. And since there's a lot of conservatives in this country, one of those parties is always going to lean strongly conservative. And I think the only way that the Republican Party realistically gets back to that is if Trump doesn't just lose in 2020, but if he loses big. So for both of those reasons, I really think Democrats need to go for a large victory, need to run the kind of campaign that might make that possible.
Agree.
Our next question comes from Russell. I will enable his microphone now. And he will be rejoining on video.
Please go ahead.
Still muted.
I cannot unmute you. So somebody behind the scene has to do that.
There you go.
There you go.
Now, please go ahead.
I would be very interested in the views of the panelists on the likelihood of Russian interference with the election, primarily, I suspect, through social media, and the potential for their being effective in their interference with our election. And I have been reading an article in the recent Atlantic, which is frightening in that respect.
Thank you. Let's take two more questions, please.
Hi, our next question comes from Thomas Brewer. I am enabling his microphone now. You're on.
Thank you. I'm emeritus faculty at Georgetown University. I'm concerned about the margin of victory and defeat in the US presidential election. My nightmare scenario is that it will be a very close election, say 51-49 in the popular vote or something like that in the electoral vote, in which case the president and his supporters will be emboldened to pursue all kinds of legal paths to contest the election. My optimistic scenario is that there will be such a substantial margin of victory and defeat that they will see it's futile that the courts, in fact, even the courts will be reluctant to get too involved in it. So I'm wondering, A, which of my two scenarios do you see? And given whichever scenario you do see, what do you think will happen afterwards?
Thank you. One more. We're still learning the ropes. This is on our second Zoom session. So.
All right, our next question comes from Virginia. Let me go ahead and activate her microphone. All right, Virginia, you're on.
Hello. This is a question for Norm or anyone else, I suppose, but for your initial discussion of things that might go wrong in the 2020 election, what are the implications of the two faithless electors cases heard by the Supreme Court recently on May 13th?
Thank you. These are very clear questions. Please go ahead. It's answered.
Yeah, well, to answer Virginia's question, and hi, Virginia, we've got some of the best political scientists in the country joining us today, which is awfully nice. This is huge, and but I think we may see a unanimous decision here. I think we're going to see a decision against faithless electors because of the chaos that could be caused if you basically give them an opening, even though, of course, electors originally were supposed to exercise their free will. What we also have to keep in mind, though, is that most states which regulate the choice of electors and the electors themselves have very limited sanctions in place. If, in fact, you decide not to vote the way in which you're pledged, you might be subject to a misdemeanor and a fine, or sometimes nothing at all. So whatever happens in that case, it could open up still some cans of worms. Just a very quick response to Thomas's question, which is, I'm a little less worried about a very close popular vote margin, more about the real possibility that Donald Trump could lose the popular vote by 5 or 6 million or more this time and still eke out an electoral college victory, which is why you need a really large margin compared to what we've seen in the past to create the kind of sweeping result that Yascha is hoping for and that most of us are as well.
Let me jump in for just a minute on the faithless elector point, because, and I suspect that Professor El-Haj, will have some thoughts on this question as well. One of the many ironic features of the case is that if you are an originalist, which is the pure jurisprudential faith of modern conservative judges, then you have no choice but to find for the system that allows electors to be quote unquote faithless, because to go back to the point about deliberation, the Electoral College was originally designed to be a filtering device whereby the notables elected to it would deliberate independently on the choices before them. So it'll be interesting to see how the originalists on the Supreme Court wrestle their way to what I think will be a strong decision against the ability of electors to be faithless. With regard to the margin of victory question, I don't think we have any way of knowing whether it will be close, however you want to define close or not. If this were an election to be decided on the traditional fundamentals that political scientists have stressed, it would not be a close election. So one of the really interesting analytical questions before us as a country and also as political scientists is, are all of the generalizations based on contemporary history of presidential elections going to be thrown out in this election because we're in a totally new world functioning outside the parameters within which traditional assumptions about what determines elections cease to function?
So I actually want to jump in on that front. On the faithless electors, we could have a long conversation, I think, about originalists on the court, and also, if I'm right, that a good number of the conservatives also are not right-wing populists, so permitting faithless electors might permit a different kind of outcome. All those things, I think, are complicated, and I don't like predicting the future. I think isn't there a saying like only fools and prophets predict, and I'm not a prophet, so I would rather not be a fool. But I think on the question of my reaction to a lot of the questions about what disaster could or couldn't happen, how close will it be, is actually to remember that there are things that can be done now. So that's why I said I think we should be talking optimistically about planning, and I think we shouldn't underestimate how different we are politically in 2020 than we were in 2016. So in 2016, I will just talk for myself. When stuff came out about how the Russians maybe had a dossier on Trump and somebody sent it to me, I was like, oh my God, that's just like insane polarization on the left. I couldn't believe it was possibly true. In 2020, I'm like, yeah, I guess they really were interfering in the election, and he might have a dossier on it. I think like there was a level that in the Democratic Party, people did not believe Trump would actually win. And I think that Hillary was really operating a campaign based on the political science fundamentals. And I think that I think it was Yascha who said people just want to go back to being able to like watch their sports. I want to do that. The entire Obama administration, frankly, the entire Bush administration, I did not check my phone 3 times a day to see if some other disaster had occurred. If I read the paper once a day, I felt like I was on top of the news cycle. I didn't need to read it multiple times a day. And I think for a lot of people, that has moved them to organizing in a way that 6,000 grassroots organizations, the last time I checked, were founded on the left, who have been mostly middle-class women. And yes, they aren't really prepared. They aren't going to be able to do exactly what they plan to do. But we're in a way better position with the fact that they are there now than in 2016 when they didn't exist. And we have had teachers' union strikes in red states that are right-to-work states. I mean, there's been a lot of mobilization and a lot of political awakening. And I think that leaves this particular crisis as uncertain. Will people suddenly, will college students suddenly say, oh my God, I might not be going to college for the next 3 years because of the incompetence in the White House or because of how this is managed, and actually come out and vote? Or will they be so worried about their own lives that they won't see it as a political moment? Those are things that are uncertain, but how the people who are politically engaged and organized respond now may affect what that is in the future. And since I assume our participants who are spending their Memorial Day talking about politics are engaged, I want to say it's a moment for action. And for me, it's a moment of talking to my neighbors who I know are Republicans, who I've lived next to for 10 years and never talked about politics with. And now I plan to. Even though that's one person, and doing more of that kind of engagement in the ways that are possible.
Can we take 3 more questions, please?
Hi, our next question comes from Paul Jackson. Paul, if you'd like to ask your question live, please raise your hand. Okay. I will ask it then. Although not constitutionally empowered to set the date of federal elections, the president can declare a national emergency that might necessitate their postponement. What factual basis could actually justify such a declaration? Is an escalation of a pandemic leading up to Election Day one such basis? Could a president invent one? If a president did so, could the Supreme Court operate as a check?
Let's have 2 more questions, please.
Our next one comes from our stream on Facebook Live. Here it goes. Professor Abu El-Haj mentioned, I'm paraphrasing, maybe we shouldn't dwell on the possible threats to election 2020. My question is, shouldn't we look at those possibilities and educate people that this could happen given Trump's history of challenging election numbers? Personally, I'm fully expecting him to launch a challenge on the election results.
And one last one, please.
All right, those are the questions we have so far. If anyone in the audience would like to ask a question, either live or in the Q&A box, feel free to raise your hand now. Okay, we have one, Eric. I will go ahead and unmute his microphone. Eric, you're on.
Still muted.
All right, there we go. Now you can hear me.
Yes.
Bill, you mentioned that these are at very extraordinary times, that in normal elections, those elections wouldn't be really close. So my question is quite simple. Should we expect that this is the new normal in future elections, that things are going to continue on that, or it's just a little bump in the road?
Just go ahead, just start.
Yeah, look, I'm going to make myself unpopular with the audience because I think that the overall thrust of the questions is a little misplaced. I mean, I was one of the first people with some other important people, including Bill and Norm and others, really warning about the extent to which somebody like Donald Trump could put our institutions in danger. I've been watching authoritarian populists take over democracies in countries around the world. And many of those which political scientists considered consolidated democracies 10 years ago are now quite clearly either outright dictatorships or very quickly degenerating into dictatorships. So I'm not in any way complacent about the danger that these new kinds of political movements might really undermine our democracy. And I don't think it's outlandish to think that something like that might happen this fall in some kind of way. But when you compare where we're at in the United States to where we're at this point in countries from Hungary to the Philippines and so on, we are still a long way off. One of the great strengths of our political system in this context is its federalism. You don't have one national electoral commission. You have elections being administered, not just in 50 states, but in countless counties and towns and so on within those states. You have a Supreme Court, which certainly in a case where you could have reasonable arguments on both sides, but perhaps the best lawyers really think it should come down on one side, might vote on the other side if that allows Donald Trump to get reelected. And arguably that's what happened in the famous Bush v. Gore Supreme Court case in 2000. But it's not a Supreme Court that's going to simply pretend that the election went one way when it very clearly went the other way. If Donald Trump tries to stay in office, even though he lost the election, I have no doubt that he's going to be removed. And if it came to that, and I think it's very unlikely to come to that he would be removed by force. So, let's take all of these worries seriously. Let's work for the integrity of US elections, which, as Tabatha pointed out, has never been perfect and which is likely to be even more imperfect this year than it has been in the recent past. Let's do everything we can to guard against that. But I fear that we're slightly in danger here of falling into paranoia of thinking that, Trump will just outright steal the election, or that even if he loses the election, he's just going to find a way of staying in office. And though I wouldn't dismiss this outright, I don't think that's a likely outcome at this point.
I actually want to echo that idea, because I think there have been significant erosions of the rule of law over this administration, and with sort of Mitch McConnell's forcing the Supreme Court nominations through, with the over-politicization of the courts, which is a pre-Trump issue. It's going back 10, 15 years, certainly since Bush v. Gore, but possibly before that. I think those are really important things to talk about. I think the demonization of the media, the militarization of opposition, the unwillingness to believe in respectful disagreement. I think all of those rule of law considerations, and I think the way that the impeachment was handled was extreme in that front in terms of some of those rule of law issues were pretty clear, and that was the Republican Party in office was unwilling to consider them. But I think that is separate from what will happen, in November, this election. So I really appreciate your saying that, Yascha, because I think it's important to see how we have some concerning tendencies right now, and those are very important. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the election itself will be stolen. And the risk, I think, of talking so much about stolen elections is that that rhetoric does get taken up by the far left as well as the far right. And that can be corrosive as well to politics.
So thank you. Those of you in the back seat, Bill?
Norm, do you want to say something? Then I'll say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to address just a couple of things I would add to that. One, on the national emergency front. Congress over decades has given the president an astonishing amount of emergency authority, far more than they should have, based on an assumption that a president would be a rational figure who would act in the national interest. And we need to, at some point, do a complete overhaul of those things. A president can take over the communications networks, a power given in the Telecommunications Act of 1934, can take over the transportation networks. But I do believe, and here I think I would join with Yascha and Tabatha and Bill as well, if we saw a naked attempt to declare national emergencies on that front, clearly just designed to block an election that he was going to lose, the Supreme Court would step in and would say that's simply not appropriate. I don't think I worry so much about a president declaring a national emergency or trying to use that authority, but every state, we have governors who have been given substantial authority over elections, even though they don't have the authority to cancel a federal election. What if, as we've seen with some of the primaries, a governor says, we're not going to allow the vote in the city because it's too dangerous for health reasons. And we get distorted results from a particular state as a consequence of that. And that's a reason why I think the aggressive push, the assertive push to do vote by mail, where much of this can take place before election day, where you're not going to have the same worry about a manipulation of results, which could happen in states or local areas, could take place. I disagree with Tabatha in this sense. I don't think you encourage efforts to steal an election by talking about it. I think we have to educate people in the different ways in which elections can be manipulated and understand why, if those happen at the last minute, they are in fact over the line and not acceptable. There has to be some sense of public outrage if things happen, and not a kind of fog of war when they're taking place because they're not aware that they might occur.
I just want to clarify, it's not that I think one encourages people to steal elections. I think that it may discourage people who are apathetic from feeling there's a point in voting. And I think this is a critical moment where we need the intermittent to the non-voter to come out and vote. So I just want to clarify, it's not that I think that offering these scenarios offers a party or other ideas about how to steal the election. I think it is more that the more talk there is about democratic dysfunction, the harder it is to get young voters, to get minority voters, to get low SES voters, to get the single mom with 3 kids to come out and vote so that she might get better health care and she might get better unemployment insurance and so on. That's more my concern, actually.
I'm just going to hop in briefly now because there are a couple of questions on the table from the audience that haven't really been addressed, and I think in fairness and respect, they should be. Is this the new normal? Boy, it better not be. We're in the middle of the worst economic meltdown in 80 years and the worst health crisis in a century. This is the new normal. God help us all. No, I don't think so. This is peak abnormal, in my view. should we be prepared for possibilities, even if they are remote, for election tampering or disruption? I think the answer to that question is yes. And that's not just a question of public education. It's also a question of mobilizing the relevant information and expertise in those groups that are capable of intervening quickly if a low probability event comes to pass. And I'm involved in some of those discussions myself. I know Norm is, I suspect Yascha is. I think it is helpful. Forewarned is forearmed. That doesn't mean hysteria, it just means preparation. And finally, many constitutions of many countries do what the Weimar Constitution in Germany unwisely did, namely allow for the declaration of sweeping emergency powers. Norm is absolutely right that Congress has given away piecemeal emergency powers to the president in very dangerous numbers, and that ought to be reconsidered. But our Constitution, thank God, does not give the President of the United States the power to declare a sweeping emergency, in effect, rule by presidential decree. And that, I think, is a very useful bulwark against the worst outcome.
So I just for a moment take off my moderator hat and add one more way of looking at that. And that, as I've seen over the last 3 years, increasingly the guardrails of democracy being eroded. And that 3 years ago, we had a strong sense that the institution will hold up and be able to keep the president from going rogue. And they did, and as details were mentioned. But with each month, the president is able to violate norms, change the dialogue, get his people into key positions in the Department of Justice now and head of intelligence, and so on, and load the court. So I see the capacity of the institutions to keep the system working being diminished month by month, and certainly the crisis is not helping build public confidence in the system. So for me, the answer to the question, what should we talk about, is I would like everybody, and I'm talking about not as a moderator, to close their eyes and think what a second Trump term would look like. And that may get him to the voting booth. Well, let's use the last moments and see whatever last questions we have. We have about a minute or two.
Hi, it looks like we have 6 questions left.
Gabby, will you be able to take only 2, please?
Only 2? Okay, I'll take one from Esther Dyson. I will unmute your mic now.
Yes, sorry. First, shout out to Tabatha. The value of dysfunction to foreign entities, they don't want Trump. They want cynicism and dysfunction and despair. My question is, right now, the coronavirus has had a much bigger impact on the coasts, in urban areas, and sort of blue places. As it spreads, as it looks likely to, especially in places that are opening prematurely, what do you see as the political impact of people's own experience on their political feelings, their learning, whatever?
One more question, please.
Okay, our next question comes from Laura in the Q&A. She says, could you address the issue and challenges generated by conducting a campaign from quarantine? How can Biden motivate his base and consolidate the party from his basement?
Let me just let me just jump in very briefly in response to Esther's question. Hello, by the way. It's good to hear your voice again. I think you've raised what I regard as the essential point, and indeed put on the table as the essential point about our political situation this year, that unlike some previous elections, I think this one is going to revolve centrally around people's personal experiences. And to Chico Mark's famous question, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? I think the answer this time is going to be my own eyes. And I view that as a hopeful development.
I'm sorry, I'd like to no, very briefly, please.
Just to follow up first, Esther, I think if we're already seeing older voters getting a little unhappy with Trump, his base. That may be the case with rural and exurban voters if this pandemic really does create a backlash there. And on the operating from quarantine, it's going to take some real clever moves on the part of the Democratic National Committee and Biden to do a convention that is a virtual one, but we've seen some quite remarkable use of video, including Zoom nationally. If they do that well, he can get his message across just fine in a virtual sense.
First of all, apologies to those of you who have questions we couldn't call on, and apologies to the panel who didn't have the chance to address everything which you'd like to say. Let me just, before I thank you, let me invite you to our next meeting, which the details supposed to be on the screen now, which here they come. We are going to be discussing China, the enemy cooperation or confrontation. Please join us. We're going to have one of the former Department of Defense officials of the Trump administration joining us, as well as scholars who are on the other side of the spectrum. And thank you very much, fellow panelists, for taking the time from busy schedule to join us for what I thought was indeed a vigorous discussion. And now, if we scroll down, we have one more thing for you to close on, and that's the panel. Oops, that's my own contribution to the discussion. And so thank you again. Be safe.